know what you're thinking right now. Did I leave my kettle on? Why did I click on such obvious clickbait? And another Warhammer content creator on YouTube? What does even differ her from everyone else? Well, while I do not know whether you left the kettle on, I can answer the other two. First off, yes, there is already a load of awesome content creators. And you should probably subscribe to them if you want high quality video essays, over posting, or interesting content. But I think you might want to stick around at least for this one, if for no other reason, so you can send me hate mail for everything I got wrong. I should also add the disclaimer that if you are a person who breaks out in hives for anything political, you ought to skip this one. Because you will be listening to a queer trans woman talk about issues such as depiction of sexuality and the rights of sexual and gender minorities, things that should not be political, but are considered such as by a certain right-wing demographic. But let us begin. Okay, so I'm going to assume that whoever is watching this is already aware of at least the basics of what Warhammer is. A miniature war game published by Games Workshop, divided into the high fantasy Age of Sigmar and the dystopian futuristic nightmare of Warhammer 40,000. In these twin settings, the forces of chaos are one of the myriads of so-called bad guys, ruled by the gang of deities, Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle and Slaanesh, and the Great Horned Rat. Or as I like to call them, the angry one, the scheming one, the diseased one, the excessive one, and Rat Lad. But for the sake of this video, we will ignore him completely. There are other channels that talk much better about the Skaven than I could ever do. Where were we? Oh yes, the Dark Prince Slaanesh, the god of excess. Regardless of version, Slaanesh is a deity focused on acts of excess and hedonism, where every chaos deity, part poor Rat Lad, represents one aspect of momentary weakness, be it wrath for Khorne, dangerous ambition for Tzeentch, despair and fear of mortality for Nurgle. Slaanesh represents perhaps the most human of feelings, driven into excess, vainglory, sloth, gluttony, carnal desires. In a sense, every other chaos deity feeds Slaanesh indirectly through their own followers. Perhaps that is why the chaos deities are so interesting, because their realm is human traits we can all see in ourselves, and that in themselves are not automatically unhealthy. It is healthy to feel anger, to have ambitions, to be aware of one's own mortality, and to feel lust and pride in oneself. It is healthy to be able to enjoy life. But chaos, because Warhammer was created 40-ish years ago in a completely different world, by a bunch of geeks, is an insidious force. While Khorne can give you power to fight, to redirect your anger, you will also eventually become an enraged mass murderer, only living to kill. While Tzeentch may open doors to knowledge you never thought possible, you will go too far and lose your humanity. Nurgle will bring joy to you and take away all your pain, but his appreciation of life means you will be a walking virus bomb, and thus bring death and despair to others. The last one feels a little bit too real after 2020. But I digress. And Slaanesh works like the Brethren. The path to corruption will start small, a tiny act of hedonism or self-perfection, perhaps a tiny vice, or a bit of pride in your combat skills. And as with all things chaos, things will escalate from there. Vices grow bigger, your pride will be brought forward on an expense of others. Small excesses turn large, because everything needs to be bigger, bolder, better to fill the emptiness inside. And at that point, the path of good intentions has led you to damnation. And I think the disgust is so far fine. These are undoubtedly evil deities copying aspects of myths from world religions, especially Abrahamic ones. It is not hard to see parallels to the Abrahamic concept of the devil, a tempting supernatural entity. The chaos deities are mystic antagonists representing human insecurities and flaws, put into a fictitious universe to give the extra-large quotation mark good guys and extra-large quotation mark something to oppose. They are intriguing because they represent our worst flaws, our failings driven to ecological extremes. Because we are not perfect beings. Every one of us can see aspects of ourselves in at least one of the chaos deities. They represent unhealthy ways to deal with healthy and normal feelings. But while I would love to end the video here on a positive note, I think we need to discuss the Slaanesh problem. Okay, so we need to identify the problem, and that is a twofold one. The first part is the textual, as in the problematic aspects of Slaanesh that can be found within official Games Workshop source material and products. The second one is a bit more uncomfortable. It's about how the reactionary sides of the fanbase see Slaanesh and use them in a trans and queerphobic context. Games Workshop's take on Slaanesh has been problematic. From a source perspective, there is a problematic aspect in how Slaanesh has been depicted through the ages, especially in the setting of Warhammer 40k. The creature myth of Slaanesh in 40k is, if I may condense things a little bit, about how the magic space elves Eldari became in their heyday decadent, their fully automated luxury gay space communism leading the Eldari to only focus on greater acts of amoral hedonism. Because the moment when you do not have to slave for your capital's overlords, you become an unhinged pervert. Damn, no wonder reactionaries like 40k so much. Anyway, this decadence of the Eldari eventually led to Slaanesh, or she who thirst as the Eldari called them, to form and imploded the vast majority of the Eldari race. When this creation myth is combined with multiple textual depictions of Slaanesh as a gender-bending entity, you start to see the problematic nature of Slaanesh. When sexuality and gender minority identities are aligned to something undeniably toxic. After all, Slaanesh is not a deity depicted caring about consent, it becomes dangerous. Especially when the setting of Warhammer 40k depicts the extra-large quotation mark good guys as extremely religious, male-dominated, theocratic fascist society with extremely puritanical views on sexuality and gender. After all, Slaanesh is depicted as taking particular joy in corrupting the morally righteous of civilized societies through subtle means, creating a situation where sexuality becomes a thing to fear, healthy sexuality being lumped together with toxic, abusive, and unhealthy forms of sexuality, where sexual and gender minorities are lumped together with abusers. The Slaanesh miniatures sold did not help, as while some are undoubtedly cool, you start to realize the old design of Slaanesh demons and followers were slightly one note, mostly focusing on sexual aspects of Slaanesh, rather than the larger picture of what Slaanesh is. Whether this is due to Games Workshop being a more puritanical company, or just the fact that boobs are easier to depict on small miniatures than Sloth and Pride, is up for anyone's guess. Either way, this leads to how reactionary parts of Warhammer fanbase have used Slaanesh. Anyone who has been a long time in the Warhammer community, regardless of their preferred Warhammer setting, know that the textual and subtextual problematic aspects of Slaanesh is tenfold by the chuddy fans. Jokes about how Slaanesh demons committing sexual assault are combined with referring to Slaanesh as he, she, it, or by using transphobic slurs, taking the rhetoric of the space opera fascists of 40k to the real world by talking about heretical sexual and gender minorities should be purged. While some who may partake in it do not see themselves as bigots, this is an actual tactic borrowed from real-world fascists. Between 1919 and 1933, there existed in Berlin a private sexology research institute, Institut für Sexualwissenschaft, headed by Magnus Hirschfeld. Hirschfeld campaigned for LGBT rights and even handed out so-called transvestite passes, which allowed trans men and women to wear clothing of their identified gender without being arrested by the police. The institute broke with the standard practice of the time by not attempting to cure homosexuality, and instead offered therapy to help gay men and women to cope with their sexuality and navigate a deeply homophobic society. Hirschfeld, a Jewish gay man, also was the first to coin the now outdated term transsexualism. He employed trans individuals in his staff and also offered endocrinologic services for transgender patients, conducting the world's first gender-affirming surgeries in the early 1930s. During the Nazi era, Institut für Sexualwissenschaft was closed down, their research burned in the Nazi book burnings, and the staff taken to concentration camps. Dora Richter, a trans woman and the first person to ever undergo gender reassignment surgery, was violently murdered by Nazis in 1933. The Nazis perceived anything that went against the hetero and cis-normativity of the time as degeneracy and something that should be purged. It is not a coincidence that this same mindset has been lashed onto by the modern alt-right when they code Slaanesh as queer. Perhaps this was something Games Workshop reacted internally to, as there was a point where it seemed Slaanesh was written out of the fantasy variant of Warhammer and replaced by the Great Horde Rat, although most likely from marketability's point of view rather than a wish to stop blatant bigotry in the community. The writing of Slaaneshi Lord suffered too. Even when Warhammer Fantasy Battles still lived, Slaaneshi champions were more often depicted as sexual abusers rather than any other aspect of Slaanesh's excess. I had noticed all of this too. Having collected Warhammer models since my young teenage years, I had taken liking to Slaanesh, finding them my favorite of Chaos deities, but my interest quickly started to wane after I discovered and repressed my own gender identity, finding the depictions of Slaanesh quite uncomfortable on some subconscious level, eventually dropping them in favor of something else entirely. And so it started to seem both me and seemingly Game Workshop that Slaanesh was unrecoverable, that there was no chance in any of the realms that somebody could make Slaanesh great again. Well, until Age of Sigmar. After sitting through all of this, you may ask yourself, how can Slaanesh be awesome at all? They sound wild, absolutely horrible. And yes, while Slaanesh is undeniably horrible, they aren't horrible on the grounds fascists pretend Slaanesh is, a sexual degenerate or a member of the LGBTQ community, but because Slaanesh is archetypal Faustian devil, and the way Age of Sigmar represents the Chaos gods, including Slaanesh, was the very reason I wanted to make this video. Now, to talk about Slaanesh and Chaos as a whole within Age of Sigmar, we need to bring back two topics that were mentioned earlier, Slaanesh in text and Slaaneshi followers as miniatures. Within Age of Sigmar, while following through with your addictions and vices does feed into Slaanesh's power, it is not until you have been driven to take a life due to your vices that your soul belongs to Slaanesh. And when it comes to vices within Age of Sigmar, sexuality as a vice has been toned down drastically. Instead, it is stated that it's vanity when it reaches narcissism that is Slaanesh's favorite vice, alongside fixation on material possessions. Wait, material possessions? It's almost as if Games Workshop is doing political commentary here, but I am sure I'm just imagining things. As for Slaanesh being gender fluid, well, it exists in the text, but it is framed substantially different than from how it has been in the past, and by the fandom at large. Slaanesh is described as being indescribable by mortal standards, and that the imagery of Slaanesh is androgynous or gender fluid is merely how Slaanesh is portrayed by some mortal cultures in the realms. Other variants include an extremely large glutton, whose body is entirely covered in tattoos, or a large writhing snake of white, or a strain of music written upon a 6-bar stave. It should also be mentioned here that within the 2019 battle tome Hedonites of Slaanesh, Slaanesh is consistently referred to using male pronouns. I at least believe this is intentional, to both move Slaanesh away from transphobic pronoun usage by a certain subset of Juddy fans, and to highlight that the earlier discussed depictions of Slaanesh are just that, mortal depictions of some entity. And this is quite interesting, because if we start to look at this from a religio-historical perspective, we can start to see something quite interesting. Because the same way, when we look at our own world and the history of religions within it, we can see how depictions of deities change when new cultures encounter them. For example, the Abrahamic capital G God, known in Hebrew as Elohim, can be traced into the supreme deity of the polytheistic ancient Canaanite religion, one entity named El. This is not controversial, and is something that can be widely found within any religion. Other examples could be the Minoan snake goddess, who is thought to be a goddess of the household or perhaps a mistress of the animals. Historians of religion have yet to find a true consensus, but some scholars relate the yet unnamed Minoan snake goddess to the Phoenician Astarte, the goddess of sex, love, and war. The Minoan snake goddess might even be an early precursor to the more famous deity Athena. I could bring in the Proto-Indo-Europeans with the water god Perkunos, whose lightning powers and attributes evolved to several Eastern European deities, most notably Perkunas, Perun, the female deity Perkuntaele, and the Finnish Perkele. But then we would be here all day, and it would derail this video too much. Point is, the depiction of deities evolve and vary, even evolving to deities of different genders in the real world. To include depictions of such in Age of Sigmar is not problematic in itself. I would even dare to argue that what Game Workshop has done with deities in Age of Sigmar, showing the wide breadth of variety in the ways they are depicted and worshipped, is inherently awesome, because it mimics aspects of our real world and the religions within it that is often missing from fantasy settings. I mean, how many times have you played a role-playing game or read a novel where the gods are as static as the Abrahamic God might seem today, as if diverse cultures would not adapt the deity to their unique needs and desires, such as they do and always have done throughout history IRL. But back to Slaanesh. I absolutely adore how Slaanesh is depicted as more than one note, "Oh, sex is bad, okay," which was the case before. As mentioned very early on in this video, Slaanesh seems to take inspiration from the devil in Abrahamic mythology, focusing on the whole breadth of the 7 deadly sins, sans wrath, because Korn is stealing that one. He's much more akin to the tempter in Matthew 4:1 to 4:11. I recommend people checking it out, because then it's quite easy to see what has served as inspiration for modern Slaanesh. The descriptions of the realm of Slaanesh in the 2016 Hedonized Bell tome remind me of Layers of Hell in Dante Alighieri's The Divine Comedy. Slaanesh is not supposed to be a deity of sexuality, but a more satanic force, which is very clearly inspired by the Abrahamic mythology. And there's a good reason excess exists among the Chaos Pantheon. Temptation is a base emotion, such as anger or depression, that the other Chaos gods hold as their attributes, and it's also something that is not necessarily toxic. A very innocent example could be you, the viewer, in the shops. Have you ever felt an urge to buy a Turkish delight or something tasty, even when you know you should be on a diet? That is the emotion that Slaanesh targets, but pushes it to the extremes. Just Korn targets anger, Sinch targets ambition, and Nerval targets fear. And as a villain, that is something that we find compelling. Otherwise, we wouldn't have, as a species, included such characters into our own mythologies. I know there are people who will lament the disappearances of overt sexuality of Slaanesh, but I do believe the way Slaanesh has changed has only been for the better. Because in current lore, Slaanesh is much more aligned with being a deity of excess, because excess is much more than sexuality, and it is that more generalized excess that current lore targets. You are not a Slaaneshi for having an amazing polyamorous relationship where everyone has a good time, nor when you enjoy life in moderation. It is when you walk down a destructive path that not only ends up hurting you, but the people around you. Slaanesh in Age of Sigmar is more of an Ur entity, a prototypical demiurge, rather than the deeply problematic, queer-coded deity of pleasure from the past. And I think Game Workshop has managed to make the change well, through the shifts on framing Slaanesh. I also do think that Game Workshop now knows the problems of Slaanesh that existed in the past, and how people use Slaanesh to be transphobic to others. We can then move to the models themselves. Have they evolved from ages of yore? Have they changed from the one-note boob snakes of old? Yes, and oh boy have they. In the current year, Slaanesh miniatures show a wider breadth of what Slaanesh is than before. While many are still undoubtedly conventionally attractive, they represent more vices of Slaanesh than before. We have demons luring you into narcissism, we have vainglory personified, we have martial pride personified, we have gluttony personified, we have characters covered in baubles and trinkets, covered in their own greed. Age of Sigmar has treated Slaanesh well, methinks, and ironically, judging by just the case miniatures themselves, they are much more diverse when it comes to gender and species than some older Order armies. You could almost believe that Chaos broke the glass ceiling before Sigmar did. Hey, in Workshop, maybe you could redo Cities of Sigmar at some point. Give us some mixed species units. I just want Dwarden fighting side by side with Free Girl. Also, female Dwarden. Pretty please? And thus, in a way, I am ending this video as I started it, by stating that Slaanesh is awesome. Slaanesh and Chaos as a whole represent human weaknesses taken to the extremes. Everyone has felt anger, ambition, thirst for knowledge, a bit of pride or sloth, or despair or fear of death. After all, we lived during a global pandemic. Now, like I mentioned before, none of those feelings are bad in themselves, but the Chaos deities feed on them and drive them to the extremes, offering unhealthy ways to cope with issues. The Chaos deities in Warhammer remind us that both in real life or in the world of miniature figures, evil is something that can only happen when we let our weaknesses or vices hurt others. And you know what? That message is kinda awesome.